In this lesson, I'll teach you more about your camera's exposure meter, how it works, and why it's an essential part of your camera. Without the exposure meter, it's a challenge to calculate the correct settings for your camera to use. Cameras without built-in exposure meters have no auto exposure modes. I doubt whether there's any digital camera like this though. Photographers who use such cameras, film cameras, older film cameras at that, use a handheld meter or guess their settings. On any of your auto modes, your exposure meter will read the light and the camera will calculate what it decides the appropriate exposure settings are. If your camera is set to manual mode, your exposure meter provides information only. The display will show you when your settings are correct, underexposed or overexposed. The meter reads the light from the area which you have selected. You can take a reading from a very small part of your composition with your spot meter. You can make a reading from mainly the middle part of your frame with the center weighted setting, or you can make a reading from across the entire composition by using the averaged metering mode. Every exposure meter must be calibrated to a standard, otherwise there would be no foundation for exposure calculations. Middle grey, otherwise known as 18% grey, is what meters are calibrated to. This means that no matter what you are photographing, the exposure meter perceives it as middle grey. This is fine if you're photographing a low contrast scene in low contrast light. When you're photographing a scene with high contrast, it's important to make an exposure reading from the part of your composition which you want well exposed. As you learned in lesson 21 in the first module, our eyes see more than our cameras can record, because cameras have a more limited ability to accurately record a broad tone range. The aim of this challenge is to take you deeper in your understanding of light and how your camera's exposure meter works. Set up to take a number of photos of the same high contrast scene or static subject. With your camera set to aperture priority and your meter set to average mode, take a few photos. Now set your exposure meter to spot metering. Take some photos with the spot on the brightest part of your composition, and next take some photos where the spot is situated to make a reading from the darkest part of your composition. You can also try this challenge with a white object against a white background. You can also try it with black on black. Take notes about what you're observing. What exposures are you most pleased with, and what were the settings you used to make them? Key points for this lesson are: without an exposure meter, it's a challenge to calculate the correct settings. There are 3 standard settings you can use. Exposure meters are calibrated to middle grey. There are even more modes to learn about on your camera. In this lesson, I'll teach you about exposure meter modes and how understanding them will help you make a higher percentage of really well exposed photographs. There are 3 or more exposure meter modes, depending on the model of camera you have. I typically switch between 2 of them to get the information I need to make my choice of how to set my exposure. These are the most common modes. Center weighted. This mode reads the light from an area in the center of your frame. The percentage of the area varies from camera to camera. It's typically around 60%. In some cameras, you can vary the area it covers. This mode is good if you compose with your subject in the center. I rarely compose that way, so I never use this mode. Before cameras included exposure mode options, they only had center weighted metering. Averaged mode. This is called matrix or evaluative, multi, or something similar depending on the camera model you have. In this mode, your exposure meter will read the light from multiple points across the whole area of your frame. Your camera will then calculate the average light value and display information based on this. Most cameras have this mode as default. This is how my camera is set most of the time. Using this mode, it will give you an overall idea of what your exposure triangle settings need to be. When the light is fairly even, using this exposure meter mode works best. Spot metering mode. When using this mode, your exposure meter will read the light from a very small area. You need to make sure the spot is precisely where you want to take your reading from. Typically, this will be from your main subject. The location of the spot within your frame varies from camera to camera. In some, the spot moves with the focus point. On other cameras, it remains fixed in the center of the frame. This is vital that you know where your spot is, otherwise your exposure readings can be very wrong. Check your camera manual or do a specific online search to find the right info for your camera model. I often switch between averaged and spot metering to help me determine how to set my exposure. Remember to think about where you're focusing in your frame and to hold your camera steady like I taught you. For this challenge, a sunny day will be best, but not essential. A high contrast scene will show you the difference in metering modes more clearly. So try and use a light subject against a dark background or vice versa. You're going to take a series of 3 photos of the same subject in the same lighting conditions. Set your metering mode to center weighted and make a few photos of your chosen subject. Zoom in and out or move closer and further away so some of your photos have more or less of your subject in the composition. Make sure your subject is in the center for some photos and off-center in others. Next, change your exposure metering mode to averaged and make a similar series of photos. And then do the same using your spot meter. Be observant of what's happening and check your monitor between photos. Make notes about what you're seeing happening. You should be able to see some significant changes in the exposure setting your camera is using. Fairly commonly for portraits, especially in situations where you've got a contrast between your subject's skin tone and the background, I will check with both the matrix metering and the spot meter. And I do this so frequently that I've programmed this button here on my camera to turn on my spot metering. So I can change between matrix metering and spot metering just by pushing this button. So I can take a reading and get an overall average metering using matrix, and then I can just push this button and take a spot meter reading from my subject's face, because when you're doing a portrait, the skin tone is the most important aspect of your composition that you want to have exposed correctly. Key points from this lesson are: there are 3 or more exposure meter modes depending on the model of your camera. The most common modes are center weighted, averaged, and spot. Choosing the best exposure mode for what you're photographing will help you make the best exposure.